Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Life began on this planet well over 3 billion years ago, and in the billions of years since then, living organisms of every conceivable type have filled the planet. Some large fraction of all those life forms, somewhere in the upper 90th percentile of all the types that have ever existed, have since gone extinct. And to the best of our knowledge, none of them had religion, apparently until the last few 100,000 years, and in only one species out of all the others, to the best of our knowledge. We're talking about incredibly small numbers here. One species out of a billion different species is not just 1%, it's not 0.1%, it's 0.0000001%. And 100,000 years on a billion-year timescale, again, a ridiculously small number.
Yeah, that really is astonishing. And I think of like the whole age of the dinosaurs, for example, that went on for millions and millions of years. And yet there's no evidence of religion among dinosaurs, right? It's just that after that last major extinction that all of a sudden our species comes along and boom, you got religion.
But even then, when our species came along, it still took millions of years before it began to leave evidence of a religion.
That's true.
So, billions of years of biological evolution doesn't produce religion until 100,000 years ago, again, give or take, and very quickly that one species spreads religion all around the planet, but only in this one species, again, to the best of our knowledge. And I'm not factoring in here Christian ideas of birds singing praises to God or the psalmist writing, "The heavens declare the glory of God."
No.
And I'd really like to hammer this point home. In so many ways, humans are just like the animals, but in some of those examples, we're extreme outliers. We have language, so do animals. We just like to think our language is on a completely different level. We have emotion. Again, so do animals, but again, we think our emotions are more complex. Intelligence, abstract thought, free will, being able to project consequences into the future, morality. In these and so many other ways, we've taken abilities that we see in other animals. They've also developed these things. We humans just ratchet those up to a whole new level, or at least we think we do. We're outliers. But when it comes to religion, it looks like that's a uniquely human trait.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, because it's true that you can find that, like you said, ratcheted up to higher levels. And I think that increasingly recognizing that has been an interesting process. And of course, there's a lot of talk about, are humans unique at all? But in this particular area, we really do seem to be unique.
This uniquely human trait, religious belief, is now everywhere. I've said this before many times on this podcast, but we now find religious belief in every slice of the demographic pie on the planet. All ages, all genders in this now polygendered world, all races, all income brackets, all levels of education and intelligence, you get the idea. It's now everywhere on the planet. But then we find that some members of our species start saying, religion? Not so much. And so we see the rise of atheism in this species that had become so thoroughly religious, to the very core religious. How did atheism evolve in this uniquely and thoroughly religious species?
Good question.
Today we've got a great expert for these questions, which are at the heart of what this podcast is all about. Dr. Will Gervais is a cultural and evolutionary psychologist and senior lecturer at Brunel University in London. He's written many papers and books on the topic of religious belief and atheism, and is a highly sought-out speaker and author on those topics. He's just published a fantastic book, Disbelief, Origins of Atheism in a Religious Species, which I found to be incredibly enlightening in my own personal spiritual journey. I felt I had to share this with my audience, and we have him here in our virtual studio. Dr. Gervais, Will, if I may, welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Will, before you joined Brunel University in London, and you made that move during the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, no less, But prior to that move, you were a professor at the University of Kentucky for almost a decade, and you were openly an atheist. In fact, you were teaching, speaking, and researching atheism. All of this in Lexington, Kentucky, the heart of the U.S. Bible Belt. That must have been fun.
Yeah, that was interesting. I started researching religion and atheism in graduate school when I was in Vancouver, and then took the faculty job in Kentucky and got to immerse myself in Bible Belt life. And interesting, I was apprehensive at first. I thought we'd move in and, I'd be in the spotlights for being an open atheist, studying atheism, and didn't find that at all. Actually, it was very welcoming, and people seemed to not mind too much that I was an atheist.
So where did you study in Vancouver?
I was at University of British Columbia for
Okay.
my PhD work. Yeah.
Okay, I'm on the island. So have you been over to the island?
Yeah. I tried to make it out there a little bit, out to Victoria, and spent some time camping on the Gulf Islands in between
Oh,
a
nice.
bit.
Great.
So, Will, I want to emphasize, as you just said, you are an atheist, but not a militant atheist like Richard Dawkins. That's the sense I get. And you're not studying atheism as a response against religious belief. I understand you grew up in a non-believing agnostic home, again, in the middle of the Bible Belt of the USA. You're surrounded by believers, but noticing that there were still atheists around, and you found this concept of atheism in a very religious world, you found it interesting. It was just a curiosity. And then you realized that you yourself were one of those atheists. And so now it became a personal curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a kind of vaguely Christian religious home where we weren't super practicing, but we'd kind of go on Christmas and Easter. My brother and I were in Sunday school a couple of times, and it never quite stuck. And I was curious about religion without really feeling a part of it. But I also didn't realize that there was this other category of atheists kind of until I was at university, actually in a class on modern religious thought, where we had a discussion board component on the class. And we got a debate point of, is God real, or something like that? Does God exist? And myself and one other student were the only two who said, like, no, I kind of don't think so. But that was the first time it really clicked for me that, I guess I'm one of those atheists.
And how did that go when you confessed your worldview?
It was interesting. So in that discussion board in the class, it was like a honors philosophy kind of class at the University of Denver. So we were approaching it pretty academically. And so there was some debate that ensued. I remember one student especially was kind of an evangelical bent. And so went straight into the apologetics of, well, what about this proof of God's existence? What about that one? And so I actually found my atheism kind of firming up at that point as I would answer kind of these debate points, because none of the proofs, I guess, seemed super compelling from a neutral perspective. Meanwhile, I guess one other student also registered her atheism. She was a bit more confident about it, but didn't debate as much in the discussion board. And then one other student actually was curious. She seemed to be wavering on her own religious commitment and had been raised as a religious believer. So throughout the semester, she actually reached out and wanted to chat with me to see what it was like being an atheist. And that was kind of fun because I didn't know. I was like, I don't know. I just figured it out myself. Chat about it and see where it goes, I guess.
So you would fit into the category. In your book, you talk about the idea that many have, that most atheists come to atheism through a rational process of deconstructing faith or whatever and come to the conclusion of atheism. But that wasn't really your journey either, necessarily.
Not really, although in some ways it felt like that because here we were in a philosophy class debating online. But I think as we had that debate on the discussion board, I realized like it wasn't that I was convincing myself with the logic. It's just that the logic was convenient to support a view that I realized I had before.
Okay.
And so now you're at Brunel University in London, and you've got this interesting group there. We interviewed one of your colleagues, Jordan Moon. We met him in episode 117, where we talked about why religions are so hung up about sex. So, as I understand it, it's a whole group you've got there looking at various scientific aspects of religious belief.
Yeah, so with the psych department here at Brunel is kind of split into two research centers. So we have a center for cognitive neuroscience, cognitive and clinical neuroscience, so that's all the brain people. And then my half is the Center for Culture and Evolution. So it's evolutionary psychologists, people doing cultural evolution work. We have a bunch of people who are trained as anthropologists who are now kind of squatting in a psychology department. And, half a dozen of us all do work kind of touching on religion. And then there's this bigger group of about a dozen of us just thinking about culture and evolution.
And we're going to come back to that idea in about 10 or 15 minutes, that idea that you've got scholars on these two sides, one on the biological, cognitive neuroscience side, and the other one on the cultural side. And unfortunately, those are two separate worlds of science, but in your book, Will, you bring those two together. It's really, I found it fascinating.
What's the, if you don't mind me asking, what's the mix of faith, non-faith, whatever, within that kind of group of scholars? I'm just kind of curious.
We don't chat about it that much, but the overall religious backgrounds are kind of like standard academia, not that religious across the board. Especially, we're a bunch of social scientists and not the Bible Belt of academia.
Yeah.
As much as there is one.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so let's start to dive in, and let's really do this from the high level, from a very high bird's eye view level, as a satellite level. You're tackling two key questions in this book, and you say these are two evolutionary puzzles that can only be solved together, not independently, not one at a time. First is the puzzle of how Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens alone came to be a religious species, and then second, the puzzle of how disbelief in gods can exist within our uniquely religious species, and despite religion being all around us, all around the globe.
Yeah, I found that kind of a useful framing for thinking about this. So over the last 20, 25 years or so, we've seen kind of a resurgence of interest in the cognitive and evolutionary foundations of religion. So asking, how is it that we're the religious species? And when I talk about humans as the religious species, I don't mean that to say that every human is religious. It's just that if we had to pick one species on Earth that's the religious one, I think we'd mostly pick humans. It's not a difficult choice at that level. But when you zoom in within our species, religion's not for everyone. So there's a very large and probably growing number of people for whom religion seems to hold no real appeal. So it's kind of these two puzzles. You flip between which puzzle you're looking at depending on how zoomed out you are. If you zoom out and look at all the species on Earth, okay, humans are the religious one. That's an evolutionary puzzle. How come we have one religious species? But within that species, now if we zoom in, we find that it's not strictly universal among our species. So how is it that we're kind of universally, but uniquely, but not universally religious? And any scientific explanation we have for religion, it needs to account for the fact that religion's not for everyone. And there's this huge number of atheists out there.
I'm curious how a thing that keeps recurring over and over as I was reading your book is as soon as our species became, quote, conscious, a religion is inevitable. It seems to me. As soon as we're self-aware, the questions start to pop up. Why? What's this world all about? We look up into, like you mentioned, birds don't look up into the heavens and wonder about the stars, even though they may use them to navigate, but they don't, right? So what do you think about that?
As to whether we kind of get religion for free as soon as you get consciousness, I guess.
I guess, yeah, how they're linked.
Yeah, I haven't worked directly on the consciousness side of it much, but there are certainly kind of strains of thought in the social science of religion work looking at kind of religion's ability to give people answers to these big questions. And so there's sort of a motivational side of religious belief, which is that as a conscious being, the world's pretty weird, and it would be nice if we had something that could answer all of these existential questions that come up. Yeah, so that there's certainly been kind of a vibrant line of research on that existential motivational side of things, for sure.
Okay.
And Scott, if you don't mind, I'm going to answer that question as well. Not to say that, Will, your answer wasn't good enough, but the first thought that occurred to me, Scott, was you say as soon as consciousness appeared, then you've got religious thinking. And there's many different ideas as to what consciousness is.
Well, yeah.
And several of them include the idea that we can find consciousness in inanimate matter. And I think people say even in subatomic particles. But one of the key definitions or the key components that I think is important is consciousness is about just being aware of your environment. That's a key thing for consciousness. and bacteria are aware of their environment.
Yeah, as a good scientist, you're pinning me down, which is fine. I'm speaking very particularly of human consciousness,
Yeah, okay.
self-awareness, the seeing myself as separate from the world, seeing other minds and stuff like that. So I am thinking specifically of that. That word has become so stretched now that yeah, you're right. Rocks are conscious too. If you stretch it right out. I'm curious as well, Doctor, when you say religion. Can you maybe define that a bit for what you're talking about when you say religion?
Yeah, defining religion, it turns out to be easier said than done.
Yeah,
But some of the working definitions that scientists have offered are that you end up with kind of different components of religion. So it's not a natural kind category where we can say these are the essential categories, they're the essential attributes that make something a religion. Instead, we can kind of say there's this like fuzzy resemblance type of thing. So things that we would think of as religions tend to be communal and social in nature, focusing on kind of abstract beliefs involving supernatural agents, usually. And also, we'd say that people tend to be kind of strongly committed to these beliefs. Not always, but for most religious beliefs, people are pretty committed to. So those are kind of the key ingredients. It's communal, it's focusing on supernatural agency, things like that. Yeah.
I read a survey years ago. They did somebody did. I don't have a reference, but anyway, same kind of thing. They were trying to define religion. They were trying to look for what are the commonalities. One of the at the end of the day, one of them candles.
It
Religions
ends
have
up being really
candles.
hard to do this because as soon as you get what seems like a working category, like a working definition, you'll find something that just feels like it shouldn't fit. So a lot of
Right.
the good definitions you can say, all right, it's communal in nature. It's kind of divides us into us versus them, and there's this almost mystical quality to it. But you could divine a lot of sports fandoms that way. They would say, well, yes,
Right.
our team really is this magical good thing. And we wouldn't want our definitions of religion to include that. So we kind of have to tweak the definitions to be different.
Well, I don't know. The Southern States football is pretty close.
Yeah, all of the SEC would disagree, right?
Okay, so before we get into the main part of today's discussion, and by the way, when I was reading your book, Will, I was keeping a list of potential questions and ideas to talk about, and that list grew into pages and pages, and I really had to work hard to whittle it down to 1 hour conversation. But that said, let's first boil down your opening 3 chapters into a 5 or 10 minute summary. In those opening chapters, one of the things you do is you identify some of the main ideas that have come up in the past couple of centuries about religious belief, the main talking points that keep coming up in popular conversation about this topic. And then you explain why those talking points are distracting or completely inadequate. So I'm just going to mention a few of these, just so the listeners have an idea of how the breadth of what you covered there, and then I'll let you respond to those. So, in the middle of the 19th century, thinkers introduced 2 competing ideas. Karl Marx gave us his sociological or psychological explanation for religious belief. Of course, we've all heard this, religion being the opiate of the masses. While Darwinism provided a biological explanation, religion and beliefs provide some kind of selective advantage for survival. So, human religiosity is an evolutionary adaptation of some kind. In the 20th century, the new atheists championed the idea that we humans just evolved to be gullible and credulous. Religion isn't an evolutionary adaptation, but an evolutionary accident. And atheism is all about outgrowing that primitive tendency. So we have Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell, and Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And as Scott said earlier, outgrowing that unnecessary phenotype is simply about exercising our ability to reason, getting informed, reading, and rationalizing. And then Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, told us about 2 competing cognitive systems in our brains, a very fast operating system based on gut feelings and intuition and superstition, versus a much slower system based on careful reasoning and logical deduction. And so some would say that religion and belief come from that first system, and atheism from that second cognitive system. And you, Dr. Gervais, you've looked at all these ideas in those 3 chapters, and you say, yeah, maybe not so much.
Yeah, I think for all of those ideas, I tried to say, here's what they are, here's why it sounds good, here's why it might not be as compelling as we think. So if we take them in order, so we could start with kind of the Marxian idea that religion is the opiate of the masses. Then this links back a bit to what we were talking about of sort of a motivational or existential drive behind religion. So here, the idea is that there's a lot of features of this world that are not ideal, and suffering runs rampant, inequality is the norm. And so if that's our living conditions, it might be very satisfying to reach out to something like religious beliefs that promise, this world isn't the main event, your rewards come after. If you get through it, it'll be fine. And that certainly does sound like a compelling idea. It seems like, given the vagaries of life, something like religion might seem compelling. I guess the only catch with that idea is over time the evidence hasn't quite fit it as well as it might. So if we look at, say, nation by nation comparisons, it looks good. If we look at places where religion is fading, it tends to be places where life is secure, inequality is lower. If we look at places where religion's thriving, life tends to be harsh and unpredictable. So that seems like a decent fit to the Marx idea. The catch is, not a lot of features of religions seem that well suited for the task that we're positing. So if we want to say, well, religious beliefs are here to make people feel better because life is uncertain, then why do we have beliefs in things like hell, which is worse than life? So that's not fixing our motivational needs. If anything, it's exacerbating them. And also, if we look at kind of what are the distinctive features of religions around the world, again, we have interactions with supernatural agents who might have various skill sets. It's not clear how that fits the existential challenge we've posed. So it just seems like it doesn't quite fit the evolutionary puzzle in the way we'd like. If we look at kind of other notions bubbling around, for instance, maybe there's a God gene or a God part of the brain where just for some reason or other, we just have religion. It's built into us. Again, that's great. We can look at behavioral genetics work, and we do find that sort of strength of religious commitment is heritable. It might run in families. And certainly religious beliefs, if we look at neuroscience work, we'll find that brain regions light up when people are, for instance, praying. And that's as it should be. It would be weird if we didn't find traces of religious stuff in people's brains. If it was turning up in people's pancreases or spleens, that would be strange. So obviously, religion's going to be encoded in our genes. Obviously, it's going to require our brains. It would be strange if that were any other way. But unfortunately, that doesn't tell us why we evolved to have religion. It doesn't tell us why it's in the genes, why it's in the brain. So again, an explanation that matches some aspects of what we're trying to explain, but doesn't quite get us to the right kind of ultimate why explanation. And then that kind of brings us to the kind of hybrid Kahneman new atheist example, which is maybe religious beliefs are kind of anchored in our intuitive processing of the world, and we get to atheism by kicking in our more kind of rational information processing system. And again, that one sounds good on the face of it. We know we have these two systems. We know everybody can flip back and forth between them. Through the late 1990s and kind of early 2000s, we actually saw a fair number of scientific papers documenting kind of low-level intuitive processes that might predispose people towards religious belief. So that one actually looked like a kind of live hypothesis that maybe religion's rooted in our intuitions. That would lead us to think that maybe atheism might be coming from that more effortful analytic system two thinking. And that one actually seemed compelling enough that when I was in grad school with my advisor, we tried to test the idea, and we found some supportive evidence and studies. We published them in the journal Science. And so the problem with that idea is it just doesn't hold up. People come back and they can't replicate that work. By now, we've got a lot of large-scale international surveys and surveys with nationally representative samples. And when we actually look for, what evidence do we have that people engaging effortful, rational, analytic thinking is what leads them to atheism? And it turns out people have been trying to find that evidence, and it's just not there. So the correlations between sort of performance on analytic thinking tasks and religion, you see small negative correlations in some societies. Those correlations disappear in other societies. So the correlation between rational thought and atheism, it's overall pretty weak everywhere we look, and it's also fickle from culture to culture. Experimental studies trying to look at causation on, if we make people think more rationally, do they report being less religious? Nobody can replicate those studies. So this is one where the idea sounds good. It sounded good enough that we tried it. 10, 15 years on, the evidence it's not that impressive. And so I think I had a whole chapter in the book where I called it the more or less myth of rational atheism, where I tried to debunk this idea that certainly if you look at kind of social media coming from the atheist side, especially sort of the Dawkins pilled new atheist side, they're all saying atheism is about rationality. We're atheists because we're so goddamn smart and good at science.
The brights.
And it turns out the science is saying that they're wrong on that. The scientific evidence has not backed that conclusion. And they stated it as a conclusion when it was an assumption on their part. They assume that rationality is where atheism come from. By now, though, we've looked for the evidence, and it doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah, it was true for them, but that doesn't mean it's true for everybody else, maybe.
Yeah, and that's one that I tried to kind of mull over later in the book, because when I talk to atheists, I meet a lot of people who say, I grew up in a strongly religious evangelical family, and then eventually I kind of thought my way out of it. So certainly a lot of people feel like that's how they became an atheist, which could be totally valid. But if we're trying to explain atheism in the aggregate, that just doesn't look like a particularly strong pathway. So we're not saying that nobody's ever kind of rationally thought their way to atheism. We're just saying that if we're trying to explain the phenomenon of atheism, rationality is at best kind of a small piece of that puzzle.
Right.
So a question occurred to me. You said the evidence just isn't there. People have looked at this or that other thing, and the evidence just isn't there. And I know that cold fusion, for example, people have been trying for decades, I don't know how long, trying to prove that cold fusion is possible, and they just can't seem to do it. But there's enough hints that there's a reason there. I was also thinking black holes for a long time. There was a lot of astrophysicists who didn't believe in black holes, and that was because they couldn't measure them. They couldn't study them. But now we have ways to begin to study a black hole. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that one, so if we want to talk about black holes or some kind of physical cosmic phenomena, a lot of the times we have excellent mathematical theory that can describe in great detail all the components of this system. And so we can say that black holes exist because we have tons of observations and we have theory that can very precisely tell us where to look. We simply don't have that on the religions. We don't have, like, anybody who's ever claimed we have theory precise enough for that level of specification is bullshitting you. So part of it is we just don't have the theoretical sophistication to make that strong of a prediction. But then also, I think the measurement side for us measuring religion is way easier. I don't need a particle accelerator to do. I need surveys.
Right. It occurred to me that probably the better example that I should have started with was consciousness itself. Pretty well everyone, experts and non, will say, yes, there is this thing called consciousness, but people who actually study it go, we have no idea what this thing is. No way to study it. So,
one thing I really appreciated about your book that you don't often, at least in my reading, come across in that type of scientific literature is your humility and the fact that you talk about science and what it is, and the fact that the simplistic definition of it that we often, that gets trucked around in our culture is that it's simplistic, that science is a lot more than just weighing empirical evidence. It is that, but it's a lot more than that. Because here's my bias, and please don't take any offense at this. Psychology for me is fascinating, absolutely fascinating subject, but it seems to me less empirically scientific than physics, let's say. There seems to be a gradation in science, and it kind of starts with physics as being kind of the most certain, the most empirical, although even there, it's far from, right, in a lot of ways. And then, chemistry, biology, and so on. But by the time you get to psychology, now you're really at some distance from that. Yeah, so maybe you could address that a bit.
Absolutely. I think my own journey to thinking about science and sort of my, anarchic nihilistic approach to science, which is that we're all trying our best, but we're all very fallible humans.
Right.
Part of that outlook, I guess, came from within psychology. We've had the replication crisis, where we've learned that a lot of our flagship findings don't replicate because, frankly, we cut corners in how we did the science for several decades. And in my own career, I kind of started graduate school before that stuff started shaking down and started publishing a few papers with some of the old, not great methods. And then I got my first faculty job and started thinking more seriously about methods, because that was 2012, which is kind of when a lot of this replication crisis narrative started building. So early in my career, I was able to kind of draw a line and say, okay, this stuff before now, those methods are not great and I shouldn't trust it. I'll try to do better moving forward. And I think because just kind of through happenstance of that timing of when I started becoming aware of the replication crisis also happened right when I was getting my first full academic job and running my own lab, and I could really make those choices. So that did make it easy for me to not get attached to especially my older work. It made it easier to throw it under the bus as I started learning to do.
Can you give an example of that replica, like a method that we thought was good but discovered really isn't?
So we found a bunch of individual findings that don't seem to hold up, but I'd say more so than any individual finding, what we've found is that if you look at a lot of up to about 2010 or so work in social psychology and psychology, you find a lot of flashy, counterintuitive studies where you try to see what's the most subtle experimental manipulation we can use to get the biggest effect. And that's not how people work. If the world worked that way, we'd have even more chaos. If subtle little manipulations could change fundamentally how people think, the world would be a strange place. And I think as a field, we kind of tricked ourselves into believing any little experiment that we could run in the lab and then get p less than 0.05 when we were on the stats.
For the non-scientists in our audience, scientists refer to p being less than 0.05 basically as a cutoff point where one can be 95% sure that they're not making a wrong conclusion.
Get p less than 0.05 when we were on the stats. We try to convince ourselves it must have been true. When it turns out we got to p less than 0.05 because we were running tiny underpowered studies with poor measurement and no theory to speak of. And if you do that, then a lot of the times just by chance, you're going to see p less than 0.05. So we kind of were believing our own hype for a long time. And yeah, for me personally, it's kind of easy to look at stages of my own career where I've had work that looking back now, I think, that's garbage. Shouldn't have even run it. Now, at the time, it was totally acceptable. And these papers were accepted in journals. I'm not proud of a lot of that old work, but I like that we as a discipline are trying to do better. And I'd say within psychology, we've had a lot of drive for people to improve their methods. So run larger studies. Don't just run 20 participants per experimental condition and hope that's good enough. Run 2,000 per experimental condition. So things like that have really helped. I think psychology has almost focused so much on improving our methods that a lot of people haven't realized that we need to improve our theory at least as much. So using large samples to test bad ideas is not better than using small samples to test bad ideas. Now you're just throwing more participants and more resources at bad ideas. So we're getting there, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
In defense of the psychology, what you said earlier made me think we see the same thing in medicine and biology. So you said you stack the deck to make the outcome so big that the stats finally can show that you have something there. In a few sentences, that's what you just said. And so, for example, we always have studies in medicine that look at the toxicity of a compound. So the way we do that is we'll use bacteria or we'll use mice, and we'll give them the equivalent of a bathtub full of this chemical. You know, these poor mice are trying to ingest these massive amounts of microplastics, for example. We give them huge amounts of microplastics, the equivalent of us eating a car. And then they say, the mice didn't like that, so there's some toxicity going on here. We do the same thing.
Yeah.
What's interesting is in social psychology for a while, we almost did the opposite. So instead of loading up this really strong experimental manipulation to show the effect, we'd try to show we were cute and clever. So we'd try to find a really tricky, subtle way to do the manipulation. Right. And so I think that one, we kind of tricked ourselves into thinking we were doing anything when we were just kind of chasing statistical noise for a while.
Right. Okay, that was chapters 1 to 3, and we got a lot to cover. Chapters 4 and 5 of your book, you give a great overview of some of the most recent work and ideas coming from two very different directions. We alluded to that in the beginning of this conversation. Two very different directions, data giving us the basic ingredients, the bits and pieces that contribute to the emergence of belief, and we're going to find out they may also explain the emergence of non-belief. So, two different mountains of data, one group saying it's all about biology, and the other saying it's all about human culture. And I want to talk about that. First, let's talk about religion arising out of our biology, our emerging from our brains. The mountain of data that comes from evolutionary psychologists and the cognitive science of religion looking at certain brain structures, neural pathways, reflexes, and signal processing. Just so the listeners know, and also that you know as well, Gervais, Dr. Gervais, a couple of years ago in episode number 78, we talked to Dr. Justin Barrett about hypersensitive agency detection and promiscuous teleology. And in your book, you talk about those too, but you also add to that some other really interesting things about mentalizing, about theory of mind and body dualism was really interesting, intuitive creationism, and counterintuitive agency. And all of these things are coming from our brains, our biology, and ultimately from our genes, working together to set the stage for religious belief and non-belief. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so in those chapters, I tried to kind of frame how scientists had been thinking about these issues. And so in chapter 4, I talked a bit about the cognitive science of religion, which I framed as a good interdisciplinary approach to Darwinize religion, to come up with an evolutionary framework for understanding how we could have religious beliefs in our species. And the cognitive science of religion kind of said, well, we could think of religion as potentially being an adaptation in its own right. So it serves some evolutionary purpose for us, and that's why we have it. Or maybe religion isn't directly selected, but it's a byproduct of something else. And the cognitive science of religion, for the most part, has landed on the byproduct side, saying religion comes really easy for us humans, but it's not an adaptation in its own right. Religion doesn't necessarily do anything for us. Rather, we evolved to have brains that are good at tracking social relationships, good at thinking about cause and effect relationships, good at projecting into the future. So we have a lot of different kind of adapted mental skills. And if you have a psychology that works like that, religious concepts just stick to it really well, certain types of religious concepts. So they're kind of our theory of mind faculties. So our ability to think about other people's minds and what they're thinking about, that's something that we need to survive as a social species. It's how we predict each other's behavior. It turns out if we're good at thinking about minds, we might be good at thinking about disembodied minds. So it could be that the ability to think of ghosts, spirits, things like that, that might just be piggybacking on our ability to kind of think through social relationships with each other. So that's just kind of one example of how we could have a brain that's adapted for one thing, social living, and as a kind of side effect, it's also good at thinking about ghosts and spirits and gods and things like that. So the cognitive science of religion really started focusing on what are these low-level cognitive biases that might work together to make religious concepts evocative, memorable, things of that nature. And I think the cognitive science of religion was a really great start in this direction. I think kind of as the years have progressed, we've seen that some of the low-level biases that they speculated about early on have been well supported by the evidence. Some of the biases that they speculated about early on were frankly never supported by evidence, but they still talked about them as if they were, which I take some umbrage with. So you were mentioning hyperactive agency detection device, and that's one that you can see papers kind of speculating about. Well, maybe since we live in a world where intentional agents are, threats and potential rewards out there, maybe we need to be good at detecting agents. So we need to be able to tell if there's a bear in those bushes, or whether there's an intruder who broke into the house downstairs. And so maybe we have systems that are a bit tripwired to over-detect agency. So sometimes I think there's a bear in the bushes, but it was just the wind. I think there's an intruder downstairs, but again, maybe it was just kind of creaking floorboards or something like that. And so kind of advocates of this idea thought, all right, well, if we're tripwired to over-detect agency in the world, then maybe this sense that there's ghosts and spirits out there is just us kind of over-detecting agency and writing off the false positives not as false positives, but assuming that there's invisible agents. And this is one, again, where all the logic sounds good, but you'd be hard-pressed to find in some of the cognitive science of religion literature a frank admission that we've never had any direct evidence for hyperactive agency detection, and there's never been any empirical demonstration linking it to religious beliefs. And that's
Wow,
one that Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I just listening to that. It's just because I've listened to a pretty good number of debates with Christopher Hitchens, for example, and he really relies on that argument for his atheism. So it's just amazing to me to hear you say that. That there is a real strong
Yeah, it's
evidence.
interesting. You see hyperactive agency detection gets brought up kind of late 90s, early 2000s in cognitive science of religion. And then right as the new atheist books started coming out, kind of 2003 to 2006, whenever that was, they jumped onto it. They really liked this hyperactive agency detection idea. And I think kind of to the new atheist, like we're outgrowing religion. I think it was appealing to say that religion is just a byproduct of other stuff. And hyperactive agency detection, it sounds plausible intuitively, but yeah, we've never had compelling evidence. Myself, my colleague Ayanna Willard, a bunch of us, we've tried to do those studies and they just seem to not work. And the advocates have yet to come up with their own evidence to persuade us otherwise. So I think in the book, I kind of said, hyperactive agency detection, it sounds fine, but it's an idea that's been tested a bit and it doesn't seem to work as advertised. But some of the other biases kind of identified by the early cognitive science of religion work does seem to have been supported over the years. So ideas like promiscuous teleology, so that comes from the work of Deb Kellerman and others. This is the idea that we like to view things as having a purpose and a function in the world. So, why is this rock pointy? Maybe it's pointy so that animals can scratch their back on it. So we're filling in a teleological purpose for just kind of like physical stuff. And that the evidence has seemed to have borne out the existence of that as a bias that we have. And the links to religion seem pretty direct. So that one seems to have fared much better than hyperactive agency detection. Similarly, like mind-body dualism seems to come very intuitively and easily to us, to the point where it's almost hard not to adopt a dualistic mindset at an intuitive level. And again, the links between kind of thinking of minds and bodies as separate to thinking about disembodied minds, that's an easy one. So some of these low-level biases kind of speculated about early on in the cognitive science of religion went on to be supported by evidence. Others never really had the evidence, but kind of have been talked about as if they have. And I think the cognitive science of religion, again, it's a really great start. I think it got the field thinking clearly about how is it that our minds might have evolved in a specific way that made it so that certain types of religious concepts were really easy for us to think. And so they kind of had the refrain of religion comes easily. And I think there are definitely valuable insights to be had there. What we've tried to add to kind of that basic model over the years is just drawing on more tools from cultural evolution, pointing out that we don't just remember things because they're good fits for our low-level intuitions. We also are kind of active learners in the world. We try to seek out information. It's not just that some information sticks to us. Instead, we're actively trying to find, well, who are the best sources of information? Who can we learn from? And, if we want to imitate others, we need to ensure that we're imitating people who are sincere in what they're telling us. Yeah, go ahead.
And you're now getting into the evolutionary psychologist and the culture contribution to this story. So maybe before we finish that sentence, there's a couple more ideas that I think are still in the category of that first mountain of data coming from the cognitive science of religion, the intuitive creationism and the counterintuitive agency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can draw a pretty good link from promiscuous teleology, where we have an intuition that things exist for some purpose, to notions of intuitive creationism. So if we tend to think things in general exist for a purpose and a function, that it's perhaps not so surprising to see some evidence, for instance, where kids seem to have a creationist bias potentially when they're younger, where if you ask them, where do new species come from? They think they were created. They don't necessarily know what they were created by or for, but that there's at least some work showing a temporary blip in child development where they seem to have a creationist kind of impulse. Now, I think the actual studies most cited for that are less compelling at making that point than they're often presented as. For instance, one of the papers says, children have this blip in creationist support, regardless of their cultural upbringing, which would be a shocking finding, genuinely. And if you look at the actual methods of that study, all the kids are from the same areas in the rural Midwestern United States. The cultural divide is whether they go to kind of regular state public school or whether they're religiously homeschooled or in fundamentalist religious schools. So if you want to say that, these kids who are not religiously homeschooled, but they're just in the normal state school and they show this temporary blip in creationism as they're growing up in one of the most strongly religious regions in the US, I think we're a long ways from showing that that's something that came intuitively as opposed to something that these kids are picking up on from their surrounding culture. But potentially, I wouldn't be shocked if it did turn out that there's some low level intuitions that make it easier for kids to think about species being created than species evolving. A lot of the mechanics of evolution via natural selection are deeply counterintuitive to humans. So I'm not trying to say that kids kind of readily are little Darwinians right out of the gate. It takes some work to get there. What was the other one? So creationism.
Counterintuitive agency.
Yeah, so that's another fun idea of kind of interfacing our intuitions and intuitive expectations with kind of cultural outputs. So it turns out if we kind of have categories of things in the world in terms of how we think about them. So physical objects, we have certain intuitive expectations for. Physical objects can't pass through other objects, for example, or if you drop an object and it's not otherwise supported, it will fall. So we have expectations about how objects move in space. We also have intuitive expectations around biological entities. So we know that there's some stuff in the world that needs to eat to survive. It reproduces, it dies. So there's kind of our folk biology. Meanwhile, we also have folk psychology. So this is a separate kind of cognitive system for tracking our social relationships with other people. And so because we can lump things into these categories, you kind of get intuitive expectations for each one. So if I tag something as a human, I get my kind of folk psychology involved. Now I'm thinking about that person's mental states. But it turns out you can take a given concept and kind of tweak some of its attributes, and you end up getting it kind of like blurring between those categories. So for example, if I have, say, a chair, this is a normal chair. It's triggering all my folk physics. I think it's probably not going to move on its own. That's not particularly interesting, but it's not violating any of my expectations. Well, I could tweak some of its characteristics. What if now it's a talking chair? So it's a normal chair, but now I can hold a conversation with it. So I've taken some kind of human-like mental faculties and given them to that chair. What happens is it seems like when we encounter these concepts that tweak our intuitive expectations just a little bit, these things seem to be a bit more memorable. So the talking chair is more memorable than just a regular chair. So if you think of various concepts out there, these minimally counterintuitive ones might just be kind of memorable and catchy, which in subsequent cultural transmission, that's a huge advantage. If something's more memorable, it's going to make it easier to pass on. And so there does seem to be some work that these concepts that minimally violate our expectations are more memorable. And it turns out that a lot of religious concepts are precisely that level of kind of minimally counterintuitive. A ghost or something that's basically a person, but now it violates physics by walking through walls. If you have, this talking tree in the forest where the spirits live, okay, it's mostly just a tree, but now we've given it some human psychology. So it's those kinds of little tweaks seem to make things a bit more memorable, which could give them an advantage in cultural transmission.
It's fascinating to me. I can almost imagine that maybe there is a book by this title, but The Counterintuitive Universe. It's just interesting to me how the more we learn about this world we're in, it seems to always be counterintuitive. Like Newton, in Newton's day, it was fairly intuitive, right? And then Einstein comes along and shows, no, it's not how it works at all, and how it works is completely counterintuitive. I'm not a physicist by any stretch, but I've read so many books on physics trying to explain to me how these counterintuitive things could be, in fact, true. And it's still very, very difficult to. But here's the thing. But we're the animal that can figure that out. They can figure out things are counterintuitive. And that is astonishing in itself, I think.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think One way to look at it is we're kind of the species that in some ways can get past our intuitions.
Yeah.
Because as you're mentioning, the world feels counterintuitive. And I think in some ways that tells us about our intuitions. So our intuitions are part of our evolved psychology,
Right.
and that psychology evolved to interact with other humans. And we're pretty good at living in kind of medium size and time scales as far as the universe is concerned. And
Right.
if we start looking at the science of really tiny things or really big things or really fast things, our intuitions are just broken because they didn't evolve for that world.
Yeah, it seems intuition seems to be all about survival, right? Our intuitions do confer Darwinian benefits, right? Because they help us to function in this world. You don't need to understand quantum mechanics to not walk into a wall, like that kind of thing. But it's when you start to dive into those things at a deeper level that you start to realize, oh, our intuitions are not necessarily correct, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Our intuitions are for surviving as opposed to probing the depths of the universe.
Right.
Okay, so that's the first mountain of data that help us understand the emergence of religious belief, the cognitive science of religion, looking at what comes from our brains, and that ultimately comes from our genes, and it's transmitted through our genes. And then there's this second mountain of data. We creaked the door open on this one already, coming from cultural evolutionists who see religion as something that is learned and transmitted through human culture. And this is really the part of the story that really sets your work apart. When I was reading it, it was just amazing. The light bulbs really started to go off for me. It moves the story in a big way. So tell us about the cultural aspect of this.
Oh, cheers. Yeah. I should mention too that as I was starting to make the connections between the cultural evolution literature and the cognitive science of religion stuff earlier in my career, I think I had the same moment that I tried to convey in the book, which is I thought like this is the missing piece to that. So the cognitive science of religion work did a good job at pointing out that there are some concepts in the world that are just going to be good fits for our evolved brains. And those concepts, they might be more memorable. They might be emotionally evocative, so we want to talk about them. And that would give those concepts an advantage in cultural transmission. But culture is not just about us encountering concepts, and sometimes they stick, sometimes they don't. So the broader cultural evolution literature, and here cultural evolution, it's a scientific subfield that you can trace back to the 1970s, where essentially people are saying, let's take the theoretical and mathematical toolkit that we've learned for dealing with genetic evolution and just tweak it to deal with cultural inheritance systems instead of genetic. But we can take a lot of the same insights. And the cultural evolutionists for a while had this distinction between content biases in cultural learning, which is the idea that there's some concepts that are just good fits for our brains. So that's content biases. Or there's context biases, where some information will persist in cultures, not because it's a great fit for our brains, but because we're learning it from different sources of information. We're selective in who we learn information from. So examples on context biases are, if you imagine, if we plopped you down in some unfamiliar you're down in the Amazon in the jungle, and now you need to learn to survive. What do you drink? What's safe to drink? What's safe to eat? So you would have kind of different strategies you might want to try. You could just do trial and error and start, drinking from different streams and eating different berries, and you'll probably die. So trial and error is oftentimes not good. We want to do social learning. So if you were in this environment and there were folks around, you could look at a bunch of people. And if you see most people are drinking from this stream, you can infer that that stream is safe to drink from. So sometimes we would do conformist learning, which is where we're just trying to learn from the majority. And a lot of the times learning from the majority is good. If most people are doing something and not dying, hop on board. You can do that and not die as well. So conformist learning is one social learning strategy that might be really useful. Another kind of context bias might be that we don't just want to learn from most people. We might want to learn from the best people. So if I want to learn how to hunt, I could just kind of copy the average hunter and I might learn something, but wouldn't I be better off finding the best hunter and then learning their skills? So we might have things like prestige bias learning, where we're trying to figure out who's the best at this, and then we selectively learn from them. But the main take home is that the cultural evolution literature says, sure, there are some concepts that are good fits for our evolved minds, which is what the cognitive scientists of religion have been saying. But that's just one part of the puzzle. We don't just absorb some ideas because of kind of the contents of the idea themselves. Instead, a lot of the action is on us selectively trying to decide who we're going to learn from. And I think that really gives us a lot of traction on explaining religion a bit more, because religious beliefs, they are learned from the community. They're learned from parents. It's something too that, if you think about something like Sunday school, for example, this is just kind of a community getting together to put in some work to teach the kids supernatural concepts. And the kids will learn that because they're looking up to, this is their community. The content biases are pointing that way. So if we look at what's kind of explaining what religious beliefs people actually adopt, it's not the case that some supernatural concepts are just so sticky that people hear about them and they're instantly a believer. Instead, people adopt beliefs that they learn from others over time. And the cultural evolution framework gives us a bit more traction for figuring that out.
So you talked about this conformist learning, and I think you called it prestige-based learning as helpful in learning how to survive. You referred to drinking from streams and following the best hunter. But to help people, the listeners, see how this fits into the learning of religion, the conformist learning would refer to people who learn about what to believe from their peers or from their influencers on TikTok, from celebrities, from various leaders, not just political leaders, but leaders in finance and what have you.
Absolutely. And what's interesting too is some of this, like, let's say I had that example of we want to learn from the best so we can be the best. Well, if I'm trying to learn from somebody who's the best, I kind of by definition don't know what makes them the best. So I might imitate too many things. So this is kind of the trick that underlies all of celebrity endorsements and a lot of advertising is that, if I want to be the best basketball player like Michael Jordan, I don't know if it's his jump shot technique or that he's wearing those Fruit of the Loom underwear. So maybe I'll buy the Fruit of the Loom underwear just in case. So a lot of endorsement is just kind of capitalizing on people wanting to imitate the successful without knowing which things to imitate.
It's kind of belief by proxy, right? Like if I trust this person, well, then I don't need to necessarily think all those details through myself because I trust this person. And in media culture nowadays, this is just so ubiquitous. Like going to all these celebrities, especially on matters of politics and stuff like that. When we were going through the pandemic, listening to people like Joe Rogan on vaccines and so on and so forth, it's very dangerous. But why do I think that because somebody's a rock star, I should listen to them about politics or anything else? Talk to me about rock music. Oh, all right, well, that's valid, right? But we do. And I think in the Christian world, in the evangelical world, this is huge, where we tend to follow very charismatic leaders, people we think must be much smarter than me. We love it when maybe a scientist or somebody who's respected. Well, I think of a guy like Francis Collins, who led the Genome Project and so on, and coming out as saying that he's a believing person. And then Christians will really latch onto that. Oh, okay, well, then I don't need to think through all those issues until it comes out that he's also an evolutionist. Then that kind of throws things off. But anyway, I think you get my point. What you're hitting on there is really important.
Absolutely. Like, is one of those things where when we're trying to learn how to be successful at something, you start out having no knowledge about what makes you successful. So you get this almost over deference where people will defer to somebody who might be an authority in one domain, but we're going to assume they're authority in other domains. Right. And you mentioned this can happen a lot in kind of the evangelical world, but I think we also saw it very much with the new atheists, where I think a lot of people assume that, if Dawkins and Hitchens are talking about hyperactive agency detection, these seem like rational science-minded people. Surely they check to see if there'd ever been a compelling study showing that was the case. And it turns out they didn't check or they whatever, but a lot of people have assumed, well, since these famous scientists are talking about it, they must be right. And they've never checked to see, well, is Richard Dawkins a scientist who's ever published a peer-reviewed paper on religion? No, he's not. So he's not an expert on this, even though he wrote the book. But
yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting you bring him up too, because I was going to ask you, is this where kind of this idea of memes comes into things in cultural evolution and Dawkins kind of introduced that idea, right? In I believe the selfish gene, where he applies biological evolutionary methods to the social world. So how do you sit on that stuff?
Yeah, so memes is interesting. So that's one that Dawkins pitched in the last chapter of The Selfish Gene back in 76, saying, okay, in genetic evolution, we have genes, which are these discrete units of information, and it's the genes that survive across generations. So the selfish gene isn't saying that they're genes that make us selfish. It's saying we need to think of the gene as the selfish unit that's living on, and genes can spread by various ways. And then he said, well, maybe cultural evolution works similarly. So introduce the meme as kind of an analog of the gene in culture space. And there were kind of multiple competing proposals on trying to evolutionize culture coming out around the same time. And it turns out memetics had a bit of sway for a while, but it never fully caught on in scientific circles. It did a little bit, but it kind of gradually got absorbed by the broader cultural evolution apparatus, in part because some of the assumptions built into memetics from the outset just didn't pan out scientifically. So Dawkins and early memeticists were saying, well, let's really push this idea that a meme is a discrete unit of cultural information and it hops from brain to brain. And then they had other assumptions of, oh, well, maybe it's neutral as to host fitness. So memes can jump from head to head. And if they kill us hosts along the way, that's fine because the memes just need to survive. It turns out some of those assumptions that culture comes in discrete little packages of information like genes, that, social information would be neutral to host fitness, those assumptions didn't pan out. So the science itself kind of faded over time just because it didn't produce the goods. But the core insights that ideas can spread from mind to mind and that there's various features of those ideas that'll make the spread faster or slower, that core insight is well preserved in kind of the broader cultural evolution work.
Now, there's another thing that comes into this chapter looking at the influence of culture and how it sets the stage for religious belief. We haven't talked about this. Credibility enhancing displays. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, credibility enhancing displays end up being probably the biggest heavy lifter in the book in explaining where belief does or doesn't come from. So the idea behind credibility enhancing displays kind of gets back to what we were talking about. If we think of with prestige bias learning, we were talking about how we want to copy the best person, but we don't know what makes them the best, so we copy a bunch of stuff. This kind of creates a market where learners are sucking up to role models to learn from them. So you could imagine you could have an unscrupulous kind of model who they've got all these kind of sycophantic followers who are trying to learn from them, and they could exploit those followers. They could say, the most important thing, the best way to be successful is to give me all your money. So if people get taken in by that, if we're kind of doing what the prestigious person says because we want to learn from them, that gives them tremendous power to exploit us. So we kind of want some epistemic self-defense where we can say, all right, I should copy what this fancy person's telling me to do, only if they really seem sincere about it. Otherwise, I should kind of worry that they might be trying to exploit me. So a good example there is, let's say, I want to learn how to hunt or forage from the best forager in my area. And he might come and say, look, here's these mushrooms that I found. They're delicious and nutritious. Why don't you go first? Now, maybe these mushrooms are delicious and nutritious, but wouldn't I like to see this person eat one first? So if they're willing to eat the mushroom, we'd call that a credibility enhancing display. They're willing to take an action to prove that what they're telling me is a sincere belief. If they're willing to kind of walk the walk, I should be more willing to believe what they're telling me. And a credibility enhancing display, it doesn't necessarily have to be costly or painful for them to do to prove their faith, but it can be. So really, we just are on the lookout for kind of behavioral cues that people are sincere in what they're telling us.
So I don't know if this is getting ahead of the game, but just to extend this again to how this plays into religion, another credibility enhancing display would be giving up a morning once a week, Sunday morning, to go to church. Of course, tithing, giving your money is another one. I'll let you carry on from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we have a psychology where we're attending to these credibility enhancing displays as we're trying to figure out kind of what we're learning from whom in the world, successful religions are really great at getting people to engage in these credibility enhancing displays. So you mentioned giving up one morning a week to go engage in kind of a communal reflection. That's a credibility enhancing. People presumably would be less likely to do that if they weren't sincere about the beliefs that they're demonstrating. If you look within religions, you'll have dietary abstention. So we're going to say that this is an animal that's otherwise delicious, but you can't eat it because your God says so. That's kind of a powerful cue that you actually are sincere in these beliefs. It also helps kind of mark community boundaries, where if we all have kind of shared dietary restrictions, that says we're all part of this group. Within religious histories, you'll have examples of, say, martyrdom. If people are sacrificing their lives for these beliefs, shouldn't that give us more confidence in those beliefs? So religions are really, really, really good at kind of amping up costs, and believers are willing to pay the costs. Therefore, this kind of becomes a good credibility enhancing display that others can look at and say, these people are sincere in their beliefs. Otherwise, why would they be engaging in all this kind of potentially costly behavior?
Right. Okay, so for the sake of time, let's now pull both of these together. We've just talked about those two mountains of data. Okay, folks, we're already over an hour long into this conversation, and believe it or not, we're only halfway into the interview. Even before we started recording, I knew we were going to have to struggle to get all this foundational material covered in a short period of time. You, the listener, really need to hear these ideas and concepts introduced and explained before we get into this next part of the conversation, which puts them all together into a really compelling and thought-provoking story. And so we're going to cut the episode off here, give you time to think about what you heard so far, maybe generate some questions of your own, which you can send to us by email or leave a comment at the webpage where you got this episode. Or if you're a member of our private Facebook discussion group, that's the perfect place to leave it as well. And then next week, we'll give you the second half of this conversation. And trust me, next week is not just more of the same. Next week pulls these ideas together and brings you to a whole new level of understanding the origins of religious belief and the origins of atheism in our uniquely religious species. It's kind of like being introduced to all the ingredients of a really great cake this week, and then next week sitting down with a fork to really get into the cake. So see you then. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.